have a little extra time because there is a lot in these slides to go over. But I'll be presenting on federal student eligibility and documentation requirements for that eligibility. So I hope you're having a good morning. Let's get started here. Here are a few of the objectives for this presentation: to present an overview of the general student eligibility requirements for Title IV aid. And so we're going to be looking at Title IV eligibility as opposed to state grant eligibility. And some state programs do have the prerequisite of Title IV eligibility before being eligible for state grants, but we'll be looking at Title IV or federal aid eligibility. I'll be reviewing the database matches that are conducted through CPS, the Central Processing System, and other databases to confirm students' answers on the match those, and any resolutions to those database matches if there are no matches. I'll be providing some information on NSLDS. Has everyone heard of that term, NSLDS?
Yes. The
National Student Loan Data System. There's actually quite a bit in this presentation about all of the features of NSLDS, so we'll spend some time on that. Oh, and the last thing, I'll be summarizing eligibility for specific federal student aid programs. So we'll start with the general overview for Title IV eligibility. So this slide actually refers to the type of courses a student is taking to be eligible for Title IV aid. So generally, besides that word generally, a student must be enrolled or accepted for enrollment as a regular student for the purpose of obtaining a degree or certificate to be eligible for Title IV aid. So a few key words in there are enrolled or accepted for enrollment, regular student, and degree or certificate. So there are three exceptions to this stipulation here. The first is a program that's at least 2 years in length that is fully acceptable for credit toward a bachelor's degree and prepares a student for the third year of a bachelor's degree. So this first one sounds a lot like an associate's degree, but it's not necessarily an associate's degree. It's a program at least 2 years long, but it gets the student to the third year of a bachelor's degree program. The second exception would be students taking, yes?
And I apologize. Please forgive me about my bad memory. The handout that we gave you all during the break, the green sheet is just for informational purposes. The other part, that's an updated version of the PowerPoint for this section. I apologize for that. I should have made that announcement before Dan started.
Okay, thanks, John. So still on this is I think the third slide in that updated presentation. Talking about the second exception to this program-specific Title IV eligibility requirements. Coursework necessary for a student to receive a state professional teaching licensure or credential. A lot of these students pursuing their teaching credential already have a bachelor's degree and they're going back for licensure only. So they're not really going for a degree or certificate, but they're going for teaching program courses. And on their FAFSA, they say that's what they're doing, is they're going for teaching program courses. And those students would be eligible for Title IV aid, not necessarily the Pell Grant, but direct loan funds, federal work study, Perkins loan funds, and the Teach grant. And then this third exception at the bottom is preparatory courses that don't lead to a degree or certificate, but prepare a student for enrollment in an eligible program. This last exception, I probably should make the distinction between preparatory and remedial courses. So preparatory courses are not necessarily, or remedial courses aren't necessarily preparatory courses. Remedial courses would be courses a student needs to take prior to being accepted for enrollment, and that's actually one of the, the student has to be enrolled or accepted for enrollment, and remedial courses would not. The student wouldn't be accepted at that point. There are some cases where the student is already accepted for enrollment or enrolled and is taking remedial courses, and those classes would count. But before the student is enrolled or accepted for enrollment, they wouldn't be able to receive aid and preparatory courses instead are courses, I think of preparatory courses as kind of bridge courses between a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. So there's an example in the Federal Student Aid Handbook of a student who is a math major, a 4-year bachelor's degree seeking math major, and he's looking to enter a computer science master's program. And he takes these preparatory courses to get into that master's level in computer science. He's able to receive Title IV aid for those preparatory courses for the computer science degree, even though they're not part of his math major. So those would be an example of preparatory courses. One stipulation with those preparatory courses is that those preparatory courses can't be more than 12 months long. So you can't be preparing for more than a year to get into an eligible program and receive Title IV aid in those classes. But those are a few of the exceptions, and once again, the program-specific eligibility requirements for Title IV of federal aid. Next, we have the student-specific Title IV eligibility requirements. There's a long list of these here. And I don't even think that we're listing all of the things that are required, but this is a list of some of the published eligibility requirements for Title IV. And we'll actually go through each one of these in the next slides. So I'll just run down a few of these, and I'll explain a little bit more about the ones that don't have subsequent slides associated with them. So the student must have a high school diploma, or its equivalent, that's the catch there, or have been homeschooled. Does anyone know what the equivalent of a high school diploma would be? Does anyone have an example? I can't. You can just yell it out. GED, yeah, that would be a good one. Also a state-approved state exam for high school equivalency. Some states have that. Some states use the GED. There's also one other thing that's not listed here with the high school diploma. That would be ATB, or ability to benefit. Has anyone heard of that? Ability to benefit. That's actually a stipulation that was around for a while, and recently was put on the shelf so that we're not using it. But I think, from what I've heard, in 15-16, they'll be bringing that ability to benefit stipulation back. So there's a regulation that says if the student doesn't have a high school diploma, if they have the ability to benefit from receiving federal financial aid, they can receive financial aid after completing 6 credit hours in an eligible program, or completing a Department of Education approved exam for the ability to benefit. So the guidance on that ability to benefit coming back into the fold isn't out yet, but I would just stay tuned to all of your IFAC and newsletters and things coming from the Department of Education. They might be talking a little bit more about that ability to benefit superseding the requirement for having a high school diploma. So with high school diploma, sorry, we're still on the first bullet, taking a while for this one. If a student indicates that their high school is, well, first, I guess students tell you what high school they graduated from in FAFSA. And we don't, it's a self-certification, we don't always need to collect a copy of the high school diploma for their file, unless they put something like this. I don't know if you can read that, but it says School of Hard Knocks in any town, North Carolina. So if a student has indicated that they graduated from a high school that you feel doesn't exist, or if you know that the student has received a diploma from a fake high school, then you would need to do a little bit more digging to investigate whether or not that student actually did complete the requirements for high school. We live in the age of diploma mills, where companies will offer a high school degree for a nominal fee of $100. Write in, you can get this high school, we'll give you your high school diploma for no work at all. Just give us $50 or $100 and we'll give you the paperwork. That won't cut it for Title IV aid eligibility purposes. And our school, University of Mount Olive, actually keeps a list of names of companies that we know are not legitimate. And if a student lists that company's name on the high school form on the FAFSA, that lets us know we need to let the student know that doesn't count. So for those students who obtained a fake high school diploma, we just recommend they go back and get their GED, or actually fulfill the high school requirement before receiving Title IV funds. So, the student must not be simultaneously enrolled in primary or secondary school also. So, there are students who are in high school still, but taking college level courses. Those students wouldn't generally be eligible for financial aid until they complete high school. Same with elementary school. I don't know if you have any elementary kids taking college courses these days. It would really surprise me if those ran into pre-K, but that's the requirement to receive aid. I mean, these students can take college courses, but they just can't receive Title IV funds to do so. The student has to be a U.S. citizen, a U.S. national, or eligible non-citizen. And the eligible non-citizen category is the one with the most variety. We'll get to that in a later slide. The student has to have a valid social security number. That's an easy one. The student has to be registered with the Selective Service if required. That would only apply to males and only certain males. So we'll go over that later too. The student has to file a statement of educational purpose on the FAFSA. It looks like this. At the end of the FAFSA, when they sign and submit the FAFSA information, they make what I like to call the FAFSA pinky swear. It's where they say, I pinky swear that I will use Title IV aid to cover educational expenses, educationally related expenses, and I promise a few other things. But that's the FAFSA pinky swear in there. That's their statement of educational purpose. The student cannot be in default on a Title IV loan or have an overpayment of a Title IV grant or loan that they've received in the past to be currently eligible. The student can also not have borrowed more than the annual or aggregate loan limits for any federal student aid program. The student can, this is an interesting one, the student cannot have a property subject to a lien or debt owed to the U.S. government. So this, a lot of the times, is if a student has a prior tax debt, the IRS will place a lien on the property. Those students aren't eligible for any Title IV funding until that's resolved. The student has to be maintaining satisfactory academic progress, or SAP, which is defined at the school level, essentially making sure the student is keeping good enough grades to get on to graduation in a timely manner. The student has to have financial need, if applicable. There are some programs that are need-based programs, some that are non-need-based programs, but for some of them, they would need need. And also the student cannot have been convicted or pled no contest or guilty to Title IV fraud, getting Title IV aid fraudulently from the federal government. One interesting thing about this is that even if the student is convicted of Title IV fraud and they pay the money back, they would then regain eligibility for Title IV aid. So government is very forgiving for Title IV fraud. So those were the student-specific requirements. So first we went over the program-specific requirements, the student-specific requirements, and now the enrollment status-specific requirements. Some programs have a certain enrollment status for the minimum level. The Stafford and Plus loans have a minimum enrollment status of half-time. And half-time would be half of full-time. That's one easy way of thinking what half-time is. Below our minimum standards for full-time enrollment, but it's good to notice that Pell, Teach-Grant, and campus-based programs do not have that half-time minimum requirement. Can anyone tell me what the campus-based programs are? There are 3 of them, at least, that I know of. I heard work study, that's one, federal work study. Perkins, yeah, and third one starts with an F. SEOG, Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant, if you say that 5 times fast. So, Federal Work Study, Perkins, and FSEOG. So those don't have the half-time enrollment stipulation there. So the minimum standards for full-time enrollment This would depend on the type of school most of the time that you're with. Most schools have this first, I think most schools operate with this first or second standard for full-time, 12 semester hours or 12 quarter hours per academic term in an educational program using the semester, trimester, or quarter system. That would be one way of defining full-time. Another one would be, if we're looking at the academic year, 24 semester hours or 36 quarter hours in the academic year. That would be for schools using credit hours but not a semester, trimester, or quarter system. And for clock hour programs, it would be 24 clock hours per week in those clock hour programs. So those are the minimum standards for full-time. And the half-time requirement up there for Stacker and plus loans would be half of whatever situation you're in. Yes?
Is it different for graduate programs?
For graduate programs, it can be different. I think that the school has discretion over how they define full-time. We have, at University of Mount Olive, we have an MBA program, and our full-time for those students is, well, there's no way a student, they have 3 credit hour courses, and they can, I don't think they can attain 8 credit hours, but I think we've defined 8 credit hours as a full-time, and 6 credit hours would still be considered half-time for our MBA. But that's a good question. It would be, it can be different for master's graduate level programs. So to wrap up the general overview of Title IV eligibility requirements, this data is collected, certain data is collected and monitored by the school. That the type of program the student's in, the student eligibility requirements, the enrollment status of the student are all collected by the school and monitored to make sure that student maintains eligibility for Title IV aid. Once again, there's that FAFSA pinky swear about the statement of educational purpose, certifying the student will be using all of their financial aid for school type expenses. And schools have to have written policies and procedures documenting how they monitor and collect that data about the students and make sure that the student meets Title IV eligibility and maintains Title IV eligibility. So the next section, we've gotten through one of those objectives, going over the general overview of Title IV aid. The next step would be to look at some of the database matches. And this is actually the majority of the presentation, looking at database matches for Title IV aid. Database matches are conducted once the FAFSA is completed. The student fills out that free application for federal student aid, and that FAFSA information gets sent over to the Central Processing System, or CPS. I like to think of it looking a little bit like this, where you have information going to and fro, up, down, left, right, back and forth, all over the place to check all these different databases to see, to determine, well, if the student's eligible for Title IV aid, and also to detect fraudulent attempts to receive Title IV aid, because there are certain students who are looking to game the system and looking to obtain as much Title IV aid as they can without necessarily being eligible for it. So CPS performs database matches with these different databases. There are 2 slides that show all of the database matches that are connected. So we'll just run down these and go through each one by one in a few slides. But the first, the Social Security Administration verifies the student's Social Security number and also the student's U.S. citizenship if he or she is a citizen. That really, I think, is the first one because it's sort of the key to all the other database matches. You have to verify the student is who he or she is, and then once you have that locked down, you can check all of the other databases after that. For non-citizens, the Department of Homeland Security double checks their eligibility status. Actually, there's a special division of the Department of Homeland Security, USCIS, or Citizenship and Immigration Services, within the Department of Homeland Security to determine eligible non-citizen status. There's a selective service database match to make sure the student has fulfilled that requirement or not. There's a VA match to determine whether or not the student is actually a veteran. There is the National Student Loan Data System, NSLDS,